Всім добрий день, чи верніше добрий вечір. I'll switch to English. Hello and welcome to Kyiv School of Economics. My name is Stepan Berko and I'm academic director of undergraduate law program. I am happy to welcome you at our premises, and this means that you are eager to talk or to listen about trade in 2025, whether trade is still interesting, possible, and like to listen about some new and fresh developments in this field, and maybe to ask some interesting questions and get some insights. So I'm grateful for the speakers that we have today, and I want to present you Dmitry Grozoubinski, former diplomat and executive director of Geneva Trade Platform. And today, moderating this lecture/discussion will be Olesia Kryvetska, partner at Inly law firm and head of the Committee of International Trade Law at Ukrainian Bar Associations. So thank you for coming to Kyiv School of Economics, and the floor is yours.
Stepan, thank you very much for having us here. Many thanks to Kyiv School of Economics for hosting us. Actually, okay, I will be short. Apart from leading the international trade law practice at Inly, which we with colleagues launched quite recently, I had worked as a dispute settlement lawyer at the World Trade Organization, and actually it was in Geneva that we met with, I met Dmitry, and yeah, I'm happy that Dmitry is here with us, Kyiv. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'm just giving the floor to you, Dmitry.
Sure. It's so lovely to be with you. Thank you all for coming out, especially the students who've come to something after 5 p.m., which I know is immoral to even ask. So I'm very flattered to see anyone in the audience at all. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Dmitry. Basically, what I do as my job is run a think tank in Switzerland, but I also basically get flown out around the world to train government negotiators on trade policy, and to work with very large companies on trying to understand what is happening in trade policy so that they can make decisions, or probably more relevantly, so that their executives feel smart at dinner parties when people ask them about it. So the goal of this kind of presentation is more on that latter half, to try to talk about some of the things that are changing international trade policy, where we've come from and where we're going, and then to hopefully get through the boring slides as quickly as possible and get into some discussion with you all about what the hell is going on. So I'm going to launch straight into it if no one minds. Okay, so one of the I suppose side effects of trade having pretty much just kind of worked for a very long time is that big business stopped thinking about international trade policy. And so people have a poor conception. They have an understanding that things are changing with the advent of the Trump administration, but very few can articulate what they're actually changing from, beyond the fact that they just generally don't like it. So the way that I try to explain international trade rules generally is by asking what they are for and what they do. And the way that I advise people to conceptualize them is to say that international trade rules are just a series of promises between governments of what they won't do. It is effectively a suspension of sovereignty, saying, I have the full tools of government at my disposal, and I'm going to promise you I am not going to use some of them, or not going to use some of those tools to their full extent, in exchange for a set of promises from you that you'll do the same with your tools. Why do they exist? Well, because you have to go back to the historical context. 1946, 1947, Europe is completely in ruins. Rebuilding it requires an obscene amount of capital from private investors. The European Development Bank of Reconstruction will do something, but basically what Europe needs is a whole bunch of private money to put that money into long-term European projects. New bridges, new factories, new roads. But capital is very, very scared to do so because fresh in their minds is the Great Depression and the trade wars that happened in and around it. So they just saw governments at the first sign of economic trouble reach for these levers of power to make it harder to ship things across borders in order to try to stimulate domestic employment. If you are planning a factory investment that may not pay back for 12 years, and you have no sense of guarantees that that factory is going to be able to get the things it needs 10 years from now, or that that factory will be able to sell to the markets you're hoping to sell into 10 years from now, that makes you very reluctant to take any kind of chance and take any kind of risk. So there was a sense among governments that what they could do to offer capital and investment markets guarantees and sureties was exchange these legally binding promises. Basically, pinky swear that there are certain things they will no longer do with their trade policy settings. And it is very, very important when you think about what is happening now to understand that that was the priority. They were trading some of their sovereignty, the ability to do things in the short term with trade policy settings, for guarantees for investment and capital, predictability. And that's why countries signed up to them. Countries wanted to signal to investors, they put a priority on demonstrating that they were a safe venue for capital. And so they gave away their ability to do things in the short term. They gave away their ability to reach for higher tariffs, to use the regulatory markets in those ways. What do those promises depend on? They depend on absolutely everyone signed up to them to fundamentally believe that they are a good idea. This is kind of the core premise of international law more broadly. What separates international law from domestic law is the absence of kinetic enforcement. No one can really make another country do something it really doesn't want to do when it comes to trade policy without resorting to sort of invasion, which is quite extreme. So the rules are premised and enforced by the sense that everyone agrees they're a good idea. Otherwise, it doesn't work. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about dispute settlement, so things like the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement, the appellate body, the dispute settlement in free trade agreements, is that they play the function of a court, like in a criminal court. Someone breaks the rules and you reach for dispute settlement to punish them back into compliance. That is not what the dispute settlement system is for, and that is not something it can really do. The dispute settlement system in every trade agreement, from the WTO to investment treaties to free trade agreements, is what it literally sounds like. It is built on the fiction that both sides agree that the trade agreement is good, agree that the rules are good, are trying to implement the rules as best they can, and have some disagreement about what the rules mean in practice. And so dispute settlement is there to resolve that disagreement through a structured process that works for everybody. None of the system was ever designed to hammer back into place a WTO member or a free trade agreement partner that no longer believes in the rules and that no longer buys into them. And this is very, very important to understand, because one of the most frequent questions we get is, can the WTO stop Donald Trump from doing some of the things he wants to do? And the answer is no, because of point 5. So one thing that's very important to understand is that even before Trump's first term, the core premise, that sort of trade-off of I give away some sovereignty in exchange we're able to have this predictability, was weakening. Governments were beginning to prioritize other policy objectives over sending a signal of predictability to investors and over sending a signal of predictability to supply chain managers. So 2 specific ways they were already changing was on national security. The World Trade Organization, for those of you who don't study trade policy, has a principle called most favored nation, which basically says, look, we understand that you may want to discriminate between Ukrainian factories and foreign factories. But could you treat all foreign factories the same way when they arrive at the Ukrainian border? Why does that rule exist? It's to create a level playing field, but it is also to make it much more difficult to use your trade policy settings as a tool in day-to-day bilateral diplomacy. If you have to charge all foreigners the same tariffs outside of a free trade agreement that takes years to negotiate, what you can't do is play golf with the Japanese president, get angry he beats you, and raise tariffs on Japanese cars by 15%, then go home, have some really good sushi, and lower them by 20%. That kind of thing is very, very tempting for political actors, as we're seeing today, but it makes it impossible to make long-term investments. How the hell do you know whether you can build a Japanese car factory if your ability to ship Japanese cars depends entirely on day-to-day transactional diplomacy that's constantly playing with these settings? The kind of core principle there is basically you shouldn't care about where your products come from, but you're allowed to care a little bit if they didn't come from home. National security people do not think that way. For the people framing the WTO, the idea was you don't care if your car comes from China or from Germany. As long as it didn't come from Ukraine, you don't care about that. It's already like an import. An import is an import is an import. Increasingly, governments and their national security apparatuses very, very much care which specific destination their imports are coming from. And that brings them into tension with this most favored nation idea of treating all exporters the same way. It is like a fundamental promise of the WTO that they just don't agree with. They are trying to use trade policy in pursuit of a number of national security objectives. These are just some of the examples. Limiting adversary industrial capacity. The really obvious example here that we're seeing is the sanctions on Russia. The sensible argument for the sanctions on Russia was never that they would lead to Putin being deposed. I think everyone understood that was unlikely. I think even people thought it would be wildly optimistic to believe that sanctions alone could make Putin reverse his policy of invasion. But there was an argument to be made that perhaps a robust enough regime of sanctions can limit the industrial capacity of the Russian state. Drain it of money, drain it of machine parts, drain it of intellectual property, drain it of the things it needs to wage an effective war. Academics are going to spend the next century arguing about whether that worked at all. But that was the idea. The US is certainly pursuing a policy of slowing adversarial technological development against China. This is the chip bans, this is the bans, the significant restrictions on visa entry for tech specialists. Basically, there are now a number of technological frontiers where the US is trying to kneecap Chinese development because they believe that those technologies, AI, quantum computing, microprocessing, will be the keys to technological dominance over the next century. So they are trying to use trade policy objectives, both in terms of what they're exporting and what they're importing, to try to hobble the ability of the Chinese state to develop technologically. They are aiming to decrease reliance on adversarial supply chains. If your country makes something that my country badly needs, and I can't readily find it somewhere else on short notice, you have a way of influencing my policy decisions. It doesn't mean you can control me. I can still choose to ignore that. Prior to 2014, the Ukrainian and Russian economies were integrated in a number of ways. There are entire Russian supply chains that stopped working after 2014 because they relied on critical Ukrainian inputs. The maritime industry being a really good example. Russia just couldn't make ship engines, and Ukraine could, because that's the way sort of factories ended up. It didn't prevent Putin doing what he did, but there is a sense that if you have this vulnerability, you can be influenced. It is something you have to think about in making decisions. So governments are actively considering how do we limit the ability of other countries to have leverage on us. And the way that they are going about doing that is making it less commercially viable to source those components from potentially hostile powers or any foreign powers. And then finally, there's this argument that the West lives in slight existential dread of saying, well, our economies are increasingly services-based economies, which is fine. It's all very lucrative. It's nice to go to an office and sit at a computer and send emails. But in the event of a war, it is much easier to convert a tractor factory into a factory that makes armored personnel carriers than it is to convert a office building full of Deloitte accountants into a factory that makes armored personnel carriers. It's also arguing that if you have a services-based economy that's based on financial services and so on, you will just lack the skills in your country should you need to fight a conventional kinetic war. So this is also an argument that they kind of pull out, and a goal of their trade policy settings of saying we need to have at least enough of an industrial base that if we have to fight a conventional war, we have something to build off of when we convert our economy to a war footing. This is the argument. For whatever it's worth, it's applied very, very, very selectively. So it tends to be like, I want to throw a bunch of money at a particular factory that is in my MP's jurisdiction, and then suddenly I remember what happens if we need to fight World War III, and then I forget it the next day. Because actually converting a modern services economy into an industrial economy would cost trillions and be really hard. So I'm going to race through this one. The other way this is changing is environment. There are environmental policy objectives that governments are pursuing. The original way that the World Trade Organization, the most free trade agreement treaties, treated the environment was very, very light touch. Basically, it was saying, the text is often something like, if we have a free trade agreement, you're not allowed to stop enforcing your environmental rules for factories that export to us. Basically trying to avoid the idea of, once I have given you access into my market and lowered my tariffs, you will stop enforcing all of your rules and regulations on factories that take advantage of that. Because when I was agreeing to lower my tariffs, I was looking at your trade regime as it actually exists and your laws as they exist. So basically not kind of creating that loophole. That doesn't do a lot for environmentalism. It also tended to focus on protection of your own domestic kind of environment. So you are obviously allowed to say at the border that a sick cow can't come in, but you generally under the trade rules had a really hard time of trying to police the welfare of that cow when it wasn't on your territory. As long as the final product is safe, you were supposed to accept it. You weren't supposed to push your environmental objectives out into the world. Environmentalism doesn't think that way. They are increasingly trying to use environmental trade policy objectives to try to achieve environmental objectives. These are terms of art. They are trying to prevent regulatory arbitrage and leaking, which are really kind of two ways of saying the same thing. What they don't want is companies to take advantage of differences in regulatory levels to try to make money. The European Union keeps passing stricter and stricter environmental regulations that increases the cost for business. Europeans live in terror of their factories going, okay, it's really expensive to make things here now. We're going to go overseas, make the exact same product without all of these regulations on how our factories are supposed to look, where our emissions are supposed to go, where our waste is supposed to be disposed of. We'll make them somewhere in a country that doesn't care as much about that, and then we're going to ship them straight back into Europe and sell them to Europeans, which is kind of a lose-lose-lose from a European perspective. There's still the same amount of environmental damage, but a bunch of Europeans have lost their jobs, and now everyone is angry.
I beg your pardon. Maybe we add magic. You know, you have heard in media. So actually, CBAM is the EU measure that might address this concern. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically, for those who aren't familiar with it, says what we're going to do when you try to ship us something that takes a lot of energy to make is we are going to work out how much you would have had to pay in carbon credits had you made it in Dusseldorf. And we're going to charge you that difference at the border if you didn't pay a carbon tax in your own country.
I keep abusing your time, sorry,
Yeah.
but that's a big issue for Ukraine, for steel industry, for example, for agricultural industry, right? And that's part of the EU accession agenda on Ukraine's side, and this is what the Olesia Kryvetska team does on the environmental issue. So this is kind of my attempt to link it to Ukraine's reality.
And I think on that, without going into like a whole CBAM thing, it's really important to understand why that can be really hard for Ukraine, because it's not just about what the rules are, it's how you've proven you've complied. So Ukrainian steel arrives at the border with Poland. It meets a Polish importer, a customs border officer, who is supposed to charge it a carbon tax. How does Ukraine prove the carbon that went into its steel? How does it prove that it either paid the right tax or that it... So the kind of paperwork requirements, the verification requirements, depending on how the EU writes them, can cause a massive problem for countries like Ukraine, especially depending on the European Union has the option not to accept a lot of easy proofs from Ukraine if they choose to do so. I think they will, but they can basically say, well, you've got a document from the government that says you've done the right thing, but we don't trust your government. So we're going to wait until one of the 2 approved auditors in the country that we as the European Union say are allowed to write this document have had a chance to visit your smelter and sign off on it for 2 years. And by the way, that will cost you 50,000 euro for the visit, and the first availability they have is 3 years from now. So it's these kind of implementation issues that are keeping your colleagues at the Ministry of Economy up at night, in addition to some of the other things keeping them up at night. They're trying to use it to encourage greener production, basically saying, hey, if we have a really lucrative market like the European Union and you want to sell into it, then the rules we apply at the border can change behavior around the world. This is the theory. If we say that you can only send us wood or furniture made from wood that was responsibly harvested, people will start responsibly harvesting wood. This is the theory. They have run into a lot of problems with implementing that in practice, but that is the dream. Yes, I really don't want to talk about that, but we can. Basically, the EU tried to do this through the deforestation initiative, can't remember what it's called, and they have so far delayed it, I think, twice, because they didn't really think through what it would mean to have thousands of individual Indonesian small farmers, half of whom are operating illegally, try to provide documentation on exactly where they got every tree to the satisfaction of Rotterdam customs officials. So the whole thing's kind of keeps getting pushed back. Another trade objective, appropriately pricing externalities. So the one thing capitalism is very, very bad at is at sending signals on things that don't affect price or value. things like how much carbon you emit, doesn't change the quality of the good, doesn't necessarily affect the price of the good, and so markets are bad at sending negative signals saying don't use quite as much carbon. So governments feel a need to step in, and then to try to maintain domestic support for green measures. Every time a government tries to introduce a green measure, the argument at home is often, yeah, but China's not going to do it, so why should we? Why should Ukrainian industry do the right thing on the environment if other countries are not going to do the right thing and they will then outcompete us? This is a way to push back on that political argument, saying, well, if those countries do the wrong thing, they won't be able to sell to Ukraine, they won't be able to outcompete you. So it's at least something of a counter argument. So the reason I kind of go through all of that, yes, sorry. Mhm. Mhm.
Drill, baby, drill. That would be kind of motto.
Yeah. So there are countries that are pushing for a prolongation of the treaty banning mineral exploration in the Antarctic. It's not going to happen because the countries that are most likely to do mineral exploration in the Antarctic are Russia and the US, and they really want to do it. So they are not going to sign up to a renewed treaty that says they can't. And if they did, they probably wouldn't honor it. So there is that push. There are measures that other governments can take on the trade side to try to limit the damage, to basically insist that minerals harvested from these sites do not enter their territory, to make it less economically desirable for companies to invest the huge amount of money required to get these resources. But to be completely honest, given how much of the next century is going to be defined by competition over rare earth minerals, and given the amount of rare earth minerals that are potentially sitting under that Antarctic shelf, it's going to be very, very hard to maintain that kind of blockade. So I'm quite pessimistic about it. Honestly, my best hope is that it just proves not commercially viable because enough rare earth minerals turn up in other places around the world that the extraction costs are greater than the market prices. Something that happens in Australia quite a bit is Australia's got heaps and heaps of minerals, but a whole bunch of them are quite deep in the ground and in the middle of a desert where it's like 44 degrees all the time and 4 hours flight to the nearest anything. And so those mines are only ever open when the natural gas price or the coal price is above a certain level. So like half of them, as soon as the coal price dips below, the iron ore price dips below like 110 or something, they all just close because it's just way too expensive to get engineers to live out there and mine this stuff and then ship it across half of Australia. So to the extent that I have any optimism at all, it's the fact that the rush of new explorations, places like Chile and a whole bunch of places, maybe decrease the competition a bit, cool it down, and there's less of a kind of gold rush once this treaty properly expires and once these guys go in. This is the most optimism I can muster. Sorry, no one ever leaves my talks feeling better than when they sat down. I work in trade policy. I'm very sorry. So yeah, I want to give that context because a lot of people are going like, oh my God, Trump's doing something that like no one's ever thought of before, or Trump is fundamentally changing things without really understanding what the way the system was before and understanding that this is an extreme spike in a trend. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so Trump and trade. My friend Alan Beattie at the Financial Times has been saying the same thing about Trump and trade for 6 months, and that is that no one knows anything. It is very, very difficult to predict what the Trump administration will do on a given day, even when they have told you what they plan to do that day, because this is not a consistent or ideological policy. It's a lot of just kind of doing stuff and then changing their mind and doing something else. So it is very, very hard to draw some sort of like broad trend of history analysis of Trump. You just have to kind of look at the things we can say that seem to be underlying his core beliefs. So one of the primary core beliefs we definitely know he definitely has is the idea that the status quo, the way things currently work, is unfair to the United States. Donald Trump practices a politics of grievance, where almost every issue is framed as someone is being unfair to us, and therefore we must act. And for decades now, long before he ran for president, he has been arguing that the way that the global world order of trade is set up is unfair to the United States. Now, this argument is slightly hard to take, given that Americans are so rich. This is the richest country in the history of the world and the most powerful country in the history of the world. So to look at a world order that they created that 70 years later has made them the richest country the world has ever known. I don't know how many of you have had the chance to like just drive around the Houston suburbs and see the size of the houses that like an average American middle-class person lives in and say, wow, this system has really done you over, America. But he fundamentally believes this. There is not absolutely nothing to it. The way that the system was built was an exchange. The US got to write the rules, but the way that they paid for it was with access to their market. They agreed to lower their tariffs below those of almost anyone, and in exchange, they got to kind of push more countries to sign up to the World Trading System, and frankly, they got to draft a lot of the rules. Americans were holding the pen. Now, Donald Trump is saying, but I hate the rules, and we've already paid for them. So he's saying it's too high a price to pay for rules he doesn't like. So he begins from that premise that the world is stacked against the US. He also very clearly believes that the ability to deny access to the US market is an effective weapon. There are 350 million odd US consumers, depending on how you do the count. They are per capita wealthier than anybody. In terms of GDP per capita, in terms of average salary, they are richer than the Luxembourg guy, which are like 55 bankers in Luxembourg. But if you kind of divide GDP, they are a huge consumption engine. They live on credit, they buy lots of stuff. If you lose the ability to sell Americans things, almost irrespective of what your business is, it is a moderate to huge blow. Trump's calculation is that he has an effective weapon to wield if he can deny others the ability to sell Americans things. He is not wrong. Just on the math, on the numbers, he is not wrong. It is also for him an incredibly effective weapon. Why? The way that the US system is laid out, the way that certain laws interact with the Constitution, means that US trade policy is almost entirely rests with the executive. He does not need Congress to do almost anything he wants to do on trade policy the way he would need them to do things domestically. If he wants to cut Social Security in the US, he needs to pass a bill through Congress. If he wants to slap very high tariffs on Ukraine because he hates Vyshyvanka for some reason, he does not need Congress to do that. He can use the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, and there are almost no checks and balances and restrictions on him within the US system, especially under a Republican-controlled Congress and a fairly friendly Supreme Court of the United States. So for him, this is a very attractive weapon because there's no process and there's no checks and balances.
In here to add that, for example, in case of the FTAs, right, the situation would be different because the delegation could have taken years to negotiate the agreement, and still there would be the Congress who would need to approve it, and the fate of the US-EU agreement perhaps is one, yeah. TTIP was that, yeah, I mean, no, that was, the Trump was the problem for TTIP, but actually the very first instance of the WTO, the one in 1947, didn't manage, I mean, the countries didn't manage to create the, let's say, WTO, the international organization, in the very beginning. Why? Because the US could not actually get the whole agreement approved by the Congress. So yeah, so actually Trump understood, I guess, this problem, and then perhaps a bit, now it's not the reinvention, but it's kind of, he's resorting to the instruments that had not been used for quite a while, and now he finds them very useful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the US system is not designed to be agile. It is not, generally speaking, designed to be quick. There are lots and lots of barriers between a president wanting to do something in most areas of US governance and it actually getting done. You need not only control of Congress, you also need to somehow cobble together a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate in order to get something passed, which is very, very difficult. You have to navigate the states, you have to do all sorts of things, beat back legal challenges. It's not a system that is designed for a president to just like do stuff, except through a series of almost coincidences and legal niche things on trade policy, where the US can declare anything, the US president can declare almost anything in international economic emergency, and then deploy not just tariffs, but financial measures, investment blocking, and even currency flow transactions in order to deal with the emergency as he defines the emergency. So this is kind of a very, very big gun that, unlike the rest of the US guns, he gets to just wave around and can fire whenever he wants. Trump also very much believes that when you threaten a country with loss of access to the US market, yes? Yep. Yep. Sure. So what happened with Colombia, and we'll talk about this in, yeah, cool, brings me to my next point, which is that one of the things that has changed from Trump to from other presidents is that he does not believe that trade policy measures should be limited to trade problems. So what happened with Colombia, the US deports illegal immigrants from Colombia to Colombia. It has always done so, frankly, it's done so for years. In this case, in order to show off what a manly man he is, they sent these guys, instead of on a regular plane, they put them in shackles and put them on a C-130 Hercules, a military transport plane, like they were cattle. And the Colombian government didn't accept them because they're still Colombian citizens, and this was a dehumanizing treatment. And this led to a blow-up. There was the threat of tariffs. The Colombians said, well, what if we do accept them on regular planes again? And Trump went, cool, and then the threat went away. And this is a pattern we're going to see a lot, where Trump makes a threat in order to look active and to pursue an objective in the short term. The other side makes a concession that is dubiously a concession at all. We saw this again with Mexico and Canada, where both sides kind of agreed to do things they'd been doing for 18 months, or change somebody's title to fentanyl czar. And then Trump's like, cool, I now get a story that says, look, I achieved something. For Trump, it is very, very important to look active and look like he is actively engaging with America's problems. If you look at the polling on Donald Trump in the US, at the moment he has a positive approval rating. And one of the things that voters say over and over that they like about him is that he seems like he is active. So for him, this kind of big throw up that makes all of the papers works really well. It is definitely coming with Europe. The US-EU, US-Europe economic relationship has like 55 different pain points on any given day. Everything from digital taxation through to European regulations on sanitary and phytosanitary, so like meat and stuff, through to different levels of tariffs, through to the trade deficit. That fight is definitely coming. The Europeans are getting ready for it. And we'll talk about how, last slide, like how governments are preparing. I will say that like it's important to remember that trade is a pretty small part of most economies. One of the reasons the US gets to do stuff like this is the US is the least trade dependent grown-up country on earth, like not counting like North Korea, I guess. But like trade is a smaller part of the US economy than it is of like any economy in the world. So fundamentally, a lot of this stuff just does not matter to them. And so there was definitely a blow up with Europe coming. And the question is, how will Europe deal with that? It's not like an existential threat. Europe is not going to burn to the ground if there are some tariffs on European goods into the US, but some people's lives are going to get worse. So it's hopefully something can be done. Does that kind of answer your question? Sorry, it was a rambling 7-point answer. Cool. Trump very much believes that bilateral trade negotiations are better for the US than larger groups. The more people there are in the room with the US, the more chance they have of forming some sort of coalition, whereas the US is the more powerful party in any one-way negotiation. Most countries need the US more than the US needs that country. So from his perspective, it's like, what I want to do is manufacture as many situations where the room is just us and the other side. And so he is going to push for that over any other kind of processes where he feels like the US doesn't have the advantage.
May I ask, does it work with China?
Still yes. Less and less every year, but still yes. The US realistically has more ability to hurt China than China is willing to hurt the US. There is a lot of mutually assured destruction here, where, for example, the Chinese could do an immense amount of damage to the US economy by stopping the export of what are called intermediate goods. So these are the things that go into things, the components. But if they did that, their own economy would collapse too. And no one would ever buy from them again if they weaponized their intermediate production. So they could do it, but they don't, and the US knows they probably won't, absent something really going wrong, like a fight in the Taiwan Strait. Yes?
And it wasn't like the EU and China was in confrontation, right? Because, I mean, for you, the risk in policy is something that is different from the US stance towards China.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer this like backwards in a circle. So one thing that's very important to understand is a long-standing US concern with Europe that predates Trump is that for the United States, China is an epochal threat. They believe the next century is going to be defined by their competition with China. They are obsessed with China. It is the only thing the two parties agree on. It is an obsession of their policy state. They view it as a genuine existential threat to US power. Their frustration with Europe is that Europe finds China slightly uncomfortable because the Chinese Communist Party is not a liberal democracy and very clearly operates in its own definition of interest and sometimes does things the Europeans really don't like, but does not have the same sense of looming horror of the Chinese that the US does. And so this is something that they have to manage and they have to think about. In the past, they've had a bit of complacency about it. They could just endlessly push the Europeans to do more, and that just the friendship would do it, but they have to be wary about pushing the EU into China's hands. With that said, the Chinese consumer is not wealthy. The Chinese average wage is, I think, 10,000. It's about 10,000 USD. So the average US wage is 5.5 times that on an individual level, spiking way up. US consumers consume at much greater rates than the Chinese. The Chinese save their money. The US live on 3 credit cards. So as a market, it is not impossible to replace the US. It's just really hard because it's really big and really rich. So it's not that it's impossible. Yes, everyone is looking to diversify their markets right now, but there's a reason they were selling to the US in the first place, and that's that there was a lucrative market for US goods. And similarly, if they were buying from the US, there was a reason they were buying US products, because they were the best value on the market. Otherwise, they would have bought something else. So whenever you throw a barrier in place of trade that's already happening, you are basically causing people to move to their second and third best option. And those second and third best options were second and third best for a reason. The other thing is, what the EU has to be wary of is like, okay, so you move away from the US to China. China is incredibly transactional too. It's not like China's some huge believer in international trade fairness and all of this stuff. So they're like, are we going to move away from the US that's doing this and into the hands of China that can then pull the exact same stunts on us the next time the Falun Gong set up in the Netherlands and we want the Dutch police to arrest them? You know, like they're worried about that kind of thing. So short answer, kinda, but it's not easy. Yes, ma'am. Well, first, let's say Taiwan is not safe. Taiwan kind of is one bad day for Xi away from best case scenario being completely surrounded and blockaded. Worst case scenario, rains of cruise missiles, sort of a very similar scenario to what you're experiencing. They just have the benefit of a body of water and an incredibly rocky coastline to protect them. The US has never given Taiwan concrete security guarantees. The US posture on Taiwan is always, please don't invade Taiwan. Maybe will do something if you do. It's strategic ambiguity. It's a policy that's run for decades. The existence of TSMC, which is the chip maker in Taiwan, for a while was considered to be an ace in the hole for Taiwan, because just so you understand this factory, if you wanted to rebuild this factory anywhere else tomorrow, it would cost you somewhere around 60 billion euro. It would take you 10 years, and there's like a 70% chance you'd fail. This factory is so precious and the equipment in it is so specialized that teams of engineers from the Netherlands, from ASML in the Netherlands, have to be on site 24 hours a day because it breaks once a week and they are the only ones on earth who know how to fix it. If they wouldn't need to sabotage this factory in the event of a war with China, like one air attack of the sort that Kyiv gets would probably knock out all of that equipment forever. because it's so finely tuned. And those chips go into everything. Your iPhone has TSMC chips. They have something like 80% market share. The problem is that increasingly China is cognizant of this problem and is spending vast amounts of money to try to, through parallel engineering, this gets completely beyond my knowledge, but basically are finding alternatives to ASML lithography to try to make ultra small chips in order to limit their dependence on TSMC. So for now, the fact that you can't, I mean, listen, a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait would crash the global economy overnight, regardless, just because it brings the US and China into economic competition and markets would go crazy. But TSMC is less and less of a guarantee every year. When I train diplomats and sort of policy people, the way that I encourage people to think about big policy choices is as an equation. And so something like TSMC and crashing the global economy is in Xi's mind a negative for invading. If I invade Taiwan or if I blockade Taiwan, huge economic damage, potential war with the United States, TSMC, we lose iPhones, right? But there are, for him, pluses on that side of the equation as well. And the question of whether he invades Taiwan on any given day is whether those minuses outweigh the pluses, right? For him, it is an absolute ideological, he genuinely believes in reunification, and Xi wants it to be his legacy. If the minuses weren't so strong, China would have invaded Taiwan a decade ago. They don't feel ready yet. They feel the costs are too high. They do not feel like they are prepared for a potential confrontation with the West yet. And their economy is slowing down, which makes it less attractive. But it's as you said, like any of these individual things can help deter, but you can never guarantee it. And you should not look at these issues purely rationally, because his kind of view of invading Taiwan is not purely economic. It's about legacy, it's about correcting a historical injustice in his mind, and so on. So there are no guarantees. More optimism. That one wasn't even trade. Things are so bad. Sorry. So that's kind of Trump's core beliefs. The last one, we've talked about this already, is that international rules and treaty commitments are only as binding as their enforcement, so not very much at all. He has a very like, where is it written approach, but he goes one step beyond that on international rules and goes, okay, but like in practice, what will actually happen to us if we violate an international treaty? And the enforcement mechanism of international treaties has always really been, well, people will stop trusting you and markets will stop feeling like you're offering guarantees. He just doesn't care. He feels like the US is economically and in terms of its force posture in a position to just weather that. So he is basically ignoring treaty commitments, not just at the World Trade Organization, but in the USMCA, what used to be called NAFTA. It's just the rules. He does not believe that the rules should be binding because he does not believe in the value of rules and in the norms that underpin rules. He just does not think they are useful. He feels they are too constraining to a more powerful party. It's the same way that Putin approaches rules and negotiations. He's like, rules are useful when you are the weaker party because they can constrain a stronger party from being able to do things to you. But as soon as you are the stronger party, why would you let rules dictate what you can and can't do? You can just break them, and if anyone tries to break them back, well, you're stronger. So you can hurt them more than they can hurt you. It's unfortunately a very, very familiar pattern playing out again. Yes? Yep. So that brings us to, I'm going to skip this slide, because we kind of talked about it already, and brings us to what can other governments do? Like what are the responses that other governments are contemplating? And they're doing a bunch of stuff all at the same time. The first one is flattery and diplomacy. During the first Trump term, Australia was very worried about steel tariffs. And so our Ministry of Foreign Affairs called Greg Norman, who is a famous Australian golfer, who had Donald Trump's personal mobile phone number, so that our Prime Minister could be like the second world leader in the world, to call him after he was elected and congratulate him and start sucking up to him, right? Everyone is currently practicing flattery and diplomacy. Vladimir Zelensky certainly tried, and he did a phenomenal job to the extent with what he was working with. Everyone is trying that. In the first instance, you want to change the mercurial Trump and you want to steer him in a different direction. You want to convince him that you're not the ones, because he could really pick any target. China is the only target on which the US will be consistent. Every other target is a target of opportunity or a target of like individual grievance. So everyone is working to not be that target. Secondly, everyone is working to identify concessions that their own public can accept, right? So I am Donald Trump, and I have come to you as the leader of your country, and I threaten you with tariffs, and I say, I am really, really concerned about illegal immigration or the trade balance. You're selling us way more than we're selling you. In your response, you know that US tariffs would be really bad for you. You know that. And you know that, like, on pure economic terms, forgetting everything else, it would make sense to just kind of bribe the US to go away. Make some concessions, give him something of what he wants, and then they leave. But you are responsible to your voting public. And the people in your country do not want to see you groveling before a foreign leader, making too many concessions. So one of the things that every world government is thinking about right now is, how do we strike that balance? What can I give Trump that he will declare as a quick win, naming a fentanyl czar in Canada, moving troops, Mexican troops, to the border that they were already there, letting the planes go through again, like all of this kind of stuff that he gets to go on TV and go, yes, we did it, but that your own public will accept. That will not be seen as too much of a surrender. Third, prepare counterpunches. So the US is probably the more powerful entity in any bilateral trade spat. If they put tariffs on your products and you put tariffs on their products, they will probably cause you more pain in a like aggregate way than you will cause them pain. The average American is less reliant on trade with the European Union than the average European is reliant on trade with America. Yep. Yep. Yes, exactly. And one of the reasons that they are thinking about using that leverage is, this is really important to understand, pain is not zero sum. And it is not a currency in the same way that other currencies are currencies. So let's say that I am a European steelmaker, and Olesia is a US soybean farmer. And our governments get into a fight, and the US government makes it harder for, like, I can't sell her country steel anymore, and she can't sell me soybeans. In economic terms, steel for me is bigger than soybeans for her. So on paper, my side is hurting more. But it doesn't actually help Olesia, the soybean farmer, if Dmitry, the steel producer in a foreign country, is having a bad day. Her business is still suffering, her business is still ruined. And what governments are thinking about doing is exactly as you said, thinking about how do we leverage pain as a political weapon. They are drawing up lists of businesses in Republican voting states in the US. They are looking at the kind of products that they can limit access to without hurting their own producers. Because if I put a tariff on steel, every single factory in my country that uses steel has to pay more for steel. So my own stuff becomes more expensive, less competitive. If I put a tariff on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, you can ride something else, it's fine. Harley-Davidson motorcycles don't go into anything, they're a final product, and they're a fungible product. You can replace them. Kentucky bourbon, you don't have to drink Kentucky bourbon. You can drink whiskey, it's fine. So they're looking at these counterpunches of going, what are ways we can hurt the US in ways that will be politically painful and where the act of not accepting as many US goods doesn't cause us even more pain.
But again, it works if the other side has domestic industry, has strong lobby.
Yep. Which is why you have to pick the ones with strong lobbies. You have to pick iconic products. You have to pick politically influential products. Like you could punish US, I don't know, management consultants, but management consultants are not very sympathetic when they're like protesting things in Armani suits out in New York. Farmers, factory workers are politically powerful and capture media attention. And that is exactly how the EU is thinking. And we know they're thinking that way because they've already drawn up these lists and made them public. If you go back into the list prepared in the Airbus-Boeing dispute, what feels like a million years ago, the European Union literally put a list together. And it's all stuff like Kentucky Bourbon and Boeing, and Harley-Davidsons.
Let's just guide the audience through the dispute. Just
I really don't think we should.
I mean, is a dispute long-lasting one for 20 years on subsidies? Actually, the EU granted subsidies, the US granted subsidies. There were two disputes, different stages, everything at the WTO. At the end of the day, they kind of got the authorization from the WTO to retaliate against it.
So both sides kind of lost. The WTO found that Europe was illegally subsidizing Airbus and the US was illegally subsidizing Boeing. Neither side agreed to give up their subsidies because they rather like them. And so the WTO said, okay, US, you can put some tariffs on the EU up to the value of these illegal subsidies or the economic impact of these subsidies. European Union, you can do the same to the US over what they're doing in Boeing. And then those subsidies could be up to like, it was like 9 billion a year, some obscene numbers. And then the US and EU very quickly got into a room together and went, it would be very dumb to do this to each other. Can't we just talk it out? And then they did. Might not happen this time. But that's kind of the background of Airbus Boeing. This made the biggest impact. This dispute changed very little about the real world, but oh my God, did it make some lawyers rich. Like this is the
whole generations of academics were raised, like doing research on the dispute.
This is cases where the paperwork had to be moved in trucks. Like the filing submissions, they had to be moved in like vans because they ran to tens of thousands of pages of incredibly nerdy technical stuff about how you make an airplane wing. The other thing is, as one of your colleagues brought up earlier, every country is thinking about how to diversify markets, but it's really hard. Because what are you really saying when you want to diversify markets? Who determines where your markets are? It's private business, generally speaking. So what you really want is for your private businesses to start buying from somewhere other than the US or selling to somewhere other than the US so that you are more secure. Problem is, it's really hard to convince them to do that. Business tends to have an optimism bias. They have a sense that maybe this too shall pass. And unless you aggressively put in measures to push them to diversify, they are going to be slow to want to make the huge capital investments in order to do that. Because if they've been successfully selling into the US market for ages, and suddenly you tell them, no, you have to go sell in China, no one's ever heard of their brand in China. So they have to do the immense amount of work to try to secure some market presence in a market they haven't really been active in before, in order to avoid a potential threat that may or may not arise through trade policy and may not last very long. So they're pretty skeptical. But every government is talking about wanting to diversify. And then the most important thing everyone is doing is waiting and praying. Unless you are the Chinese, again, there is no guarantee that you'll be the one that Trump comes for in any serious way. There is very little you can do to head it off at the pass. You can do everything right. And he's not tied to like real world statistics. Recently, he gave a press conference where he delivered a long rant about the UK's trade surplus with the United States, complaining that the United Kingdom sells a lot more to the US than they buy from the US. It was very passionate. It was very compelling. He clearly believed what he was saying. It's not true. Like, just objectively, the numbers are wrong. The UK buys more from the US, according to US statistics, than it sells to the US. So reality can't save you. If he decides that he doesn't like reality, he will substitute his own. Really smart diplomacy, as Ukraine found out. I think, like, initially everyone was very complimentary of Vladimir Zelensky's diplomatic efforts at the White House. Didn't make a difference in the medium term. Counterpunches could work, could not work. All you can really do is take it day by day. And remember that so far, despite all of the noise, the only thing that has actually changed in trade terms is a 10% tariff on China. That is the only thing that has actually happened. Everything else has been threatened and then either pushed back or dissolved. And even the things that they have tried to do, including on China, in areas like the de minimis on customs, basically making it so that small value packages have to go through customs and fill in proper customs paperwork, even that got rolled back almost immediately because they realized it was too hard. So there is a lot of just hoping he doesn't notice you and hoping that when he does notice you, he kind of bungles whatever he tries to do to you, gets bored and moves on, going on. And that is happening at the government level and is definitely happening at the corporate level. One thing, and this is way outside of my area, but there's a bunch of business students in the room. Markets so far do not believe there is going to be a series of trade wars. They do not buy it. You can look at the major indices that would be crashing if people thought that a massive trade war was 10 minutes away. Steady as rock. Even when things happen like he threatens Canada and Mexico, they do this. Dip for a day. The markets do not believe that he is going to pull the trigger on this in any major way. The markets have been very wrong before, but it kind of goes back to that diversification point of, like, at the moment, the business community's consensus is that, yes, this is potentially scary, and yes, there's a lot of noise, but they have not convinced themselves that it is going to get really bad. So that might be a moment of cheer, depending on how much you trust the intelligence of the average investment banker. And that's what I've got. I have no idea how I'm doing on time. Sorry.
You are. Right. We have technically 10 minutes left. Yeah. Thank you, Dmitry, very much. Do you have any questions? Oh, yeah, we do.
So Something that's happened and this will be me at the well beyond my levels of expertise, but you asked and I'm on a stage with a microphone, so I get to just like say stuff. The countries that Gen Z live in are not getting poorer. What is happening is a breakdown in the traditional path to upwards mobility. So it used to be that there was a pattern that your father worked in a field. Sorry, your grandfather worked in a field. Your father worked at a factory. You go to university, and through that ladder, you reach comfortable middle class, right? There was that guarantee. You go to university, you get a reasonably good job, statistically speaking. That has broken down in a lot of countries. The kind of connection between what you are traditionally supposed to do to get ahead and a reasonable expectation of getting ahead has become really splintered for a whole bunch of factors, and wealth has concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. The number of billionaires in the largest economic class that is growing in the US is billionaires. They have expanded by factors of something like 400x the number of billionaires in the country. So but the good news is that the money is still there. We are not living in a Great Depression style situation where there are no jobs or where there is no capital, where inflation and growth are both, well, inflation's high and growth is low or negative. We're not there. So in a lot of, at least the West, but in most economies are growing, and inflation is generally, kind of wars aside, generally manageable, which means that the problems are fixable, right? This is not a question of the economy not working in a general sense. What it's not doing is working in a specific sense in order to create pathways for young people to kind of describe affluence, and that is a fixable problem. That is a redistribution problem rather than a fundamental economic problem. You can fix that with taxes. You can fix that with programs. You can fix that with better market regulations, by cutting down on antitrust, monopolization, by enforcing worker right protections, by, for example, making flexible work and gig work pay better and have better working conditions. If all you did was significantly improve the wages for gig workers in the economy, you would see significant wealth increases for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, like that. At the moment, there is that kind of, the way that the market is functioning is putting a lot of the kind of power in the hands of employers at the expense of gig workers. And that is pushing more of the workforce into gig work and more of the job vacancies into gig work. And that is punishing, but like, we can fix that. This is not a divinely mandated problem. It is a function of our regulatory system and our tax system. So there are things we can do, and a big part of it is like, when Gen Z, and to a lesser extent millennials, we're kind of useless, but we're trying, have more power over the older generation in terms of they displace them within political structures, there is a hope that there is opportunities to make things better. It's the best case I can make for hope.
Now I know how to respond to my sister, 10 years old, 10-year-old younger sister. Thank you. Okay, thank you for your question. Okay, I have a question. If, while you are coming up with another one, you wrote this book, Why Politicians Lie About Trade. I've got my copy. Actually, why politicians lie about trade, and what are the manipulations, perhaps? Like your top manipulation, your own list of top manipulations. All the politicians resort to across the board, across all the jurisdictions.
Sure. So all politics, all governance, right, is fundamentally about making choices between competing interests. Anytime the government does anything, including doing nothing, they are effectively making a choice that will benefit one group of society at the expense of another group. You can think of absolutely any policy in the world, from where to build a police station to what the income tax rate should be. That is a choice between competing priorities. In theory, in democracies, politicians should be explaining to you the choices that they are making so that you can understand the trade-offs that they are making. I understand that what I'm about to do is going to hurt employers, but we think it's important to improve the protections for gig workers. So I am making a choice between employers and gig workers, and in this case, I'm going to steer policy towards gig workers. Trade, because nobody understands how it works, and because it seems to involve foreigners, gives politicians the ability to talk about their choices as if they weren't choices. So when Donald Trump presents what he wants to do with tariffs, his argument is, listen, I'm not making a choice between competing US interests. I am choosing between foreigners who don't matter, who are going to pay these tariffs, and American workers who I'm going to be supporting, right? And this happens again and again and again. The genesis of this book was during the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom, where the ones pushing Brexit were basically making the case of saying, hey, we can leave the European Union with no consequences whatsoever on trade. This is not going to be a problem for us on trade. It's fine. They were obfuscating that choice, and they basically rely on the fact that international trade is counterintuitive, and the names for things don't make any sense. And no one really thinks about it as long as it's working to be able to sell their choices as fake. So most of the manipulations, the things that I talk about in this book are basically just variations of that. When someone says, oh, it's okay if we can just fix the border by making it all digital. That hides the choices that you are making, that hides the complexities. When they talk about a free trade agreement, creating thousands of jobs, and they talk about it as win-win, they don't talk about who loses out when that happens. So basically, that is the very short answer to your question. I promise there are more words in the book than that, but that's the 15-second elevator pitch. And it really came from, because during the Brexit debate, there were people, including very senior academics and very senior policy professionals, who were advocating things that were actively dangerous, that had their advice been followed, would have led to hundreds of thousands of job losses, probably farmer suicides, really, really dark stuff. And so the public debate was poisoned by that. And that sort of radicalized me into spending a lot of weekends typing.
Any other questions? I've got the last one. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Two really good questions. On the China stuff, about, I don't know how many years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party had to do a huge initiative, which was basically turning around to their party officials and their industry titans, and especially their kids, with one message: stop posting photos of your Lamborghinis on Instagram. It wasn't Instagram, it was the Chinese version, I can't remember what it's called, Weibo. But so they had, it's not, I mean, inequality has always been sort of a problem in China, obviously, but they're very, 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 very sensitive to perceptions of inequality. right? Especially because in the Chinese economy, in the US mindset, all US people think that they are going to be billionaires one day. And so it's like, oh yeah, like this billionaire his yacht has a little yacht that follows it around. And that's awesome because I will have that one day. They deserve it. They must have worked hard. That is a US thing, right? That's a very, very American thing. In China, the success of their, well, firstly, the party officials who are that rich are rich not because of their salaries, but because of corruption. And secondly, even their private businesses are very entangled with the state, and China still ostensibly clings to Mao ideology. You know, it's capitalism with Chinese characteristics, it's all this kind of stuff. So for them, the perception issue of wealth inequality is a much sharper pain point than it is for the US. But in terms of actual kind of inequality, it is more between kind of groups. It's rural versus city. It's kind of split that way. So it is something that they obviously have to manage. It's one of the reasons like sinology is so hard to study because it's such a complicated country. But it's certainly something that they have to think about. And like Chinese decision making is guided first, foremost, and third most by the survival of the CCP. And the only actual threat to CCP survival is internal. The world's most paranoid person about color revolutions lives in the Kremlin. The second most paranoid person about color revolutions lives in Beijing. So they kind of, when they see things that are beginning to pick up resonance, especially on Chinese social media, that they relentlessly monitor and censor, they hammer it down, but it's a slightly different to the American context. To your question about, is Trump able to present what he is doing and tell compelling stories about his policies? Yes. Yes, he is. And it's not just because he has a very friendly relationship with Elon Musk and X. The US president has a bully pulpit. The US president, sorry, this is a term of art. The US president, anything the US president says gets widely reported, right? Doesn't matter what it is. So by definition, any kind of news story about Donald Trump begins with what he said and the way he said it. And then in like paragraph 4, there is some wonky nerd being like, well, that's not how trade works, but nobody reads that far. So in a lot of ways, he gets to set the narrative, he gets to tell his story, and yes, he gets to identify enemies of the people from a MAGA perspective. And the way that US politics is stratified means that there is a huge ecosystem to amplify that. There are a lot of people who are waiting for their signal on like, okay, who is what's our 5 minutes of hate today? Like, oh, okay, cool, we're attacking this group. Or we've decided that these guys are the enemy. Which is why that like 3 minutes after he releases the idea about Greenland, suddenly we've got op-eds in the Wall Street Journal being like, yes, Greenland should belong to the US. Well done, sir. So he has that ability. What he can't do is really fundamentally alter the perceptions of Americans about their day-to-day life.
The lack of eggs now.
The lack of eggs. The recent poll that came out saw Americans' perceptions of the economy and whether it is moving in the wrong direction go from 43 to 53% between one poll. 10% jumps up, right? There is very little you can do or say to change the experience of someone who is suddenly paying more at the grocery store, right? So what we're going to see over the next 4 years is Trump attempting to pull people into his constructed reality through the force of the infinite media attention he commands. And that is going to war with Americans' perceptions of their daily life as they live it and any kind of competing narratives that manage to break through. But it's incredibly hard to form a compelling competing narrative when Donald Trump sucks up 99% of the oxygen in any conversation, because when a US president says insane nonsense, it leads the news. You can't not report that, even if you think he's lying, or even if you think he's blustering. If the US is like, we're gonna nuke the Netherlands if they don't give us Maersk, that is going to be on the front page of a newspaper. And so this is something that the opposition really struggles with, of like, how do you get attention and how do you get traction on competing narratives when like he's always on the front page and the story is always about him. But you can't, there's only so long you can pull that magic trick until Americans start realizing that their lives are not getting better.
Good.
Cool. Thank you so much.
I loved the evening. Yep. Thank you very much, Dmitry. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our guest. Thanks again, the Kyiv School of Economics, Ukrainian Bar Association for co-hosting, co-organizing the event. And yeah, so let's work. Let's continue working. Yeah. Trump, Russia. Okay, we have a lot of things to do. Yes, wait and pray, inclusive. Good. Thanks very much. Thank you, Dmitry.
What you wanted? Yes? Yeah. I would like to do nothing like this. I hate all parts of my job, but I'm not this. Thanks. I hate every part of my job except this. Except everything.